Okay, so today we're going to talk about air masses. Okay, an air mass is a huge mass of air that has generally the same temperature and humidity. Okay, that means the same amount of water vapor and a uniform temperature throughout, and they can cover hundreds or even thousands of miles. Okay, now they're broken up into, depending on how you look at it, 5 or 6 types. Okay, you have tropical, which is coming from the tropics. We're going to revisit all these in a minute. So they're typically hot. You have polar, which is coming from the poles. They're cold. And then you have air masses that are coming from land. We call these continental, and these are dry. Then you have air masses that are coming from the water. These are called maritime, and these are moist. There's a 5th one, and you could actually add a 6th one if you want. There's arctic. This is air masses that are coming from the very high poles, the North and the South Pole, above the Arctic Circle, and they're very, very, very cold. Okay, they can be maritime or continental as well. Okay, so on the planet, this is how it looks. You have a mixture of every one that I just said. Okay, so first let's go over what the Tropic of Cancer, the Tropic of Capricorn, and the equator are. So the equator, this is the place on the planet, as we said when we talked about revolution and rotation. This gets the most direct amount of sunlight throughout the year. Everything under the Tropic of Cancer, so this is around Cuba, Cancun, Northern Africa, and then going down to just above South Africa, around Argentina. Everything in between these has a very consistently hot climate. Okay, we call these the tropics. Okay, they have a very temperate climate. Okay, everything above here, this is where you get your seasons, because they're affected by the tilt. Okay, now all of those air masses that I said before have some kind of hybrid with another one. So you have continental air masses that are situated on the actual pieces of land on the continent, and they're very dry because they're not exposed to water at that time. Okay, then you have maritime air masses that are coming from the water, and they're very moist. They hold a lot of water. Now when these mix with one another, when they become hybrids, when different conditions affect that air mass, it affects the weather tremendously. Okay, so first we'll start with maritime polar air masses. So maritime polar air masses are air masses that are cold. Okay, so they're coming from the poles, but they're also moist, so they bring in cold, moist air. Okay, so this affects continental Europe, continental Russia, continental America, Canada, New York City, all of the Midwest. This affects us a lot, the maritime polar air mass. Okay, remember, it's moist because it's coming from the sea, but it's also cold because it's polar. Okay, then you have continental polar air masses. This affects the United States a lot, especially the northern part of the United States, including New York City. Continental polar air masses are very dry because they're coming from land, but they're also very cold. Okay, so different from what we just said. Although these are both cold, they're both polar. One has a lot of moisture and one doesn't. They both affect the continental United States and continental Europe and Russia, as well as continental Africa and South America in the southern regions. Okay, next we have maritime tropical. So tropical air masses are coming from the tropics, so they're very warm, but these ones are maritime, so they hold a lot of moisture. So maritime tropical air masses, they affect us tremendously. Okay, especially in New York City, coming from the Caribbean. Huge warm air masses coming from this region, from the tropics, are coming north, they're coming south, and they're affecting the weather on the continents. They hold a lot of moisture, but they're very warm, in stark contrast to continental dry air masses. Okay, so that's the continental dry air masses, is your desert regions. They're very hot. They're in the tropics or near the tropics, so they're affected by tropical weather, but they are not moist. Okay, the air mass is coming from a very hot but dry piece of land. Okay, they're coming from a hot region, but a region that is not situated over water. Okay, so the continental tropic air mass affects us tremendously. All of the United States. It comes from Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas, and northern Mexico, just like the Sahara Desert. Very, very dry, continental dry. Okay, very low moisture. It's coming from huge stretches of land. Okay, that it doesn't go over water, but it's still in the tropics. So it's dry, not moist, and it's very warm. Okay, so we've done maritime polar, continental polar, maritime tropical, continental tropical, and you also have Arctic. You can look at Arctic in two different ways. Continental Arctic, which is coming from your Greenland, your Antarctica, okay? These big pieces of land that are in the Arctic, above the Arctic Circle. They're really cold and they're really dry. You also have maritime Arctic. Okay, maritime Arctic is the same thing, except it's over water, so they can carry water. So they carry a lot of moisture. So to recap, you can see how all of these air masses affect the weather on the planet. There's some places on the planet that are affected by many different air masses, us included. See, we're affected by the continental air masses of tropical climates. Okay, that's bringing hot, dry air. We're also affected by maritime tropical climates, bringing very moist and hot air, but we're also affected by maritime polar air and continental polar air. That's the United States. We have a very crazy climate for that reason. Europe is very similar, whereas South America is not like that. It's very much affected by maritime tropical moist air, hot moist air. That's why this is just an enormous rainforest. That's why this region of Africa is just an enormous rainforest, okay? Whereas this region of Africa is not. It's very dry. It's affected by continental dry air. Very hot and dry air. Okay, Britain, Spain, France, all these regions are similar to the United States. They're affected by many different types of air masses. You have warm, tropical, moist air coming up into Europe, but you also have polar, cold, warm, and dry air hitting the continent too. But you also have continental polar air coming from Russia. So it's causing a lot of rapidly changing patterns in the weather. Okay, remember, really just 5 concepts. Tropical is coming from the tropics. It's very warm, very hot. Polar is coming from the poles. Okay, it's very cold. Continental is coming from the land, so it's very dry. Maritime is coming from the water, so it's very moist. Arctic, like I said, can be broken into 2 as well, but the most common characteristic of Arctic air is that it's just super, super cold. It's frigid. Okay, so these air masses are really important to understand for when we start talking about fronts, because fronts are where 2 different air masses collide. Okay, so when 2 different air masses collide, they have very different uniform characteristics. One can be very hot and moist. The other one could be very hot and dry. They can be very cold and moist, cold and dry, and those are going to sometimes cause violent storms because of it's almost like 2 armies colliding with one another. They have very, very different characteristics that are all both uniform to one another. Okay, air masses. Thanks, guys.